When I received the result from the paternity test, everything fell apart. My husband, the man I love and have been with since college, suddenly started doubting me. "Our daughter isn't mine," he said, and then began questioning everything. I couldn't believe what was happening. But as the truth slowly unfolded, I discovered that what was even more terrifying than his doubts was the fact that this child wasn't ours. When I saw the test results, my heart tightened. It couldn't be wrong, but I still felt a whirlwind of emotions rush over me. My husband, the man I loved and had been with since college, was standing in front of me with a cold, suspicious look in his eyes. I couldn't understand why this was happening. I had never done anything to make him doubt me, and I knew I had never done anything wrong. But here he was, holding the result of a paternity test, and it said that our daughter wasn't his biological child. Just a few weeks ago, we were happy, taking care of our daughter, planning for the future. Now everything seemed to be falling apart because of one test. I pleaded with him, assuring him that I had never cheated, that I loved him more than anything. I couldn't even understand why he had taken the test in the first place, but all he said was that something didn't feel right. "Our daughter can't have brown eyes if we both have blue eyes," he said, his voice filled with suspicion. I was stunned, not understanding why he was focusing on such a small detail. We had been together for years, he knew my genetics and his own, so why now, all of a sudden, was this an issue? I tried to explain, but it felt like he wasn't listening. He demanded that I leave the house, saying that if I couldn't prove my honesty, he wouldn't be able to live with me anymore. His words felt like a death blow, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could this be? I hadn't done anything wrong. We had been together for so long, how could he doubt me like this? My husband wasn't the man I had married anymore. He had become distant, cold, and jealousy had taken over him. He started retreating into his office for hours, no longer paying attention to me or our daughter. He began asking to see my phone, but I couldn't accept that without a valid explanation. I told him I wouldn't do it anymore unless he could give me a reason. And so, we began to argue, but he stayed silent, and I couldn't figure out a way to ease his doubts. We had once loved each other so much, but now, this suspicion was pushing us apart. I didn't know how to prove my innocence, how to make him believe that I had never cheated. I couldn't stand the feeling of being doubted, but I also didn't want to lose the man I loved, and especially not our daughter. But his words, his cold gaze, everything made me feel terrified. This doubt was eroding our relationship, and I didn't know what to do to regain the love and trust we had once shared. Each passing day, the tension between my husband and me grew. He was no longer the man I had married. The suspicion had replaced the love we once shared, and I felt myself being pushed further away from his life. Since the paternity test results came back, everything had changed. He was no longer the warm, caring husband I knew, but a stranger with cold eyes, sometimes filled with anger and resentment. He no longer held me when I was upset or worried, nor did we have movie nights or meaningful conversations. He retreated into his office, spending hours in silence, and every time I tried to enter, he would tell me to go away without explaining why. I was left wondering if there was anything I could do to bring him out of his fear and doubts. Those days were incredibly hard. Every time I tried to talk to him, he shut me out. At first, I tried to convince him, explaining that I loved him and that our daughter was his, but all I received in return was silence. He no longer wanted to listen to me, and every question I asked seemed to only make him angrier. Sometimes, he would coldly tell me that if I truly loved him, I would let him do whatever he needed to prove the truth. But I didn't know what else to do to prove my innocence, as I couldn't change his doubts. I kept trying to find ways to fix everything, but each time he looked at me with those suspicious eyes, I felt like I was losing him piece by piece. One day, he suddenly demanded that I give him my phone. "You have nothing to hide, right?" he asked, his eyes filled with pressure. At first, I agreed, but after several requests, I started to feel invaded. I asked him to explain why he needed to check everything, and why he couldn't trust me anymore. He didn't answer, just remained silent and went back to his office. I wondered if I had done something wrong, or if I had done something to make him lose his trust in me. Why would he trust a piece of paper from a test more than me? the person who had been with him through everything for so many years. But then there were times when I felt utterly helpless. I didn't know what to do to break down the wall that had built up between us. I had loved him so much, and I didn't want to lose my family. I didn't want our daughter to grow up in a home full of tension and suspicion. I missed the days when we were partners, with no shadows of doubt between us. Now, I just wanted everything to go back to the way it was, but the more I tried, the harder it seemed. There were moments when I looked into his eyes, hoping to find a spark of the man I once knew, but all I saw was darkness and distance. Every night when I held our daughter in my arms, I wondered how all of this would end. Could I convince my husband that I had never lied to him, that I loved him and would always love him? Would we be able to overcome this crisis and remain a happy family, or would we be torn apart by suspicion and silence? But the answer seemed to drift farther and farther away, and I began to feel hopeless. When my husband closed the door to his office, I sat alone in the silent house, listening to our daughter's soft breaths. Would we ever heal as a family? Or had everything crumbled due to these doubts and the silence between us? Everything seemed to spiral out of control when the results of the next round of paternity tests started coming in. Both my husband and I couldn't believe what we were seeing. After 2 rounds of paternity tests for our daughter and endless arguments about who the biological father was, we decided to do one final test to be sure. And then, when the final result came in, both of us were shocked. Our daughter, not only was she not my husband's biological child, but she wasn't mine either. That moment was truly a shock. I looked at the results, my mind racing, and I couldn't understand what had happened. I carried this child. I gave birth to her, and now I was realizing that the child I had loved and cared for all these years wasn't biologically mine or my husband's. It felt like the ground beneath me was collapsing. It wasn't that I didn't love her, but this truth was too terrifying to process. I just wanted a logical explanation, but there was nothing that could make me feel better. We didn't know what to do, and while my husband was still tense from the results, I could only look at him with confusion and despair. Thoughts raced through my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder what had happened. How could there have been a baby switch at the hospital? Could we have been given the wrong child? These questions kept swirling in my head with no reasonable answers. I couldn't believe that something like this could happen to our family, to the child I had cared for as my own. And then, as if the reality of the situation wasn't enough, a police officer came to our house, requesting statements and informing us that the incident would be investigated. The feeling of bewilderment overtook me. I didn't know what to do. It felt like my entire world was falling apart. Everything I had once thought was true had been erased. My husband also didn't know how to react. He still loved our daughter, but everything had become far more complicated and painful. We were facing a situation that wasn't just about doubts over paternity anymore. It was something much more serious that could affect our entire family. As we tried to deal with everything, I also started to worry about the long-term consequences of this situation. Would our daughter be taken away from us? Could we find her biological family? And if we did, could we build a new family with them? All these questions made me feel afraid and unsure of how to face the situation. While I wanted to keep my daughter with me, I couldn't help but think about whether she might have another biological family, a place where she truly belonged. I couldn't stop thinking about the impacts this could have on us and our daughter. How would we manage to overcome this and not hurt our family even more? Everything seemed too complicated, and all I wanted was to know the truth. But would I be strong enough to face it? After the police came and took our statements, I felt like my whole world was being torn apart. Every time I thought about the fact that our daughter wasn't biologically ours, I felt like I was living in a nightmare. We had raised her for so long, and now the truth had changed everything. I couldn't stop wondering if things would have remained the same. Would we still be happy if this hadn't happened? Could I restore the trust and love between us, or had everything come to an end? My husband wasn't doing any better than I was. He loved our daughter, I knew that for sure. But the pain of finding out that the child he had cared for and loved wasn't his biological child had truly broken him. He became even more distant, retreating into his office, no longer speaking about his feelings. I saw him becoming increasingly stressed, exhausted, but I couldn't do anything to soothe him. He no longer wanted to hear anything from me. For the first time in years, we felt like complete strangers. One evening, I tried to get into his room to talk. When I opened the door, he was sitting there, staring out the window, not turning around. The silence in the room was heavy. "Do you still love me?" I couldn't bear it anymore. I just wanted an answer. He didn't turn to face me, but finally, with a hoarse voice, he said, "I don't know anymore. Everything is falling apart." Those words struck my heart like a heavy blow. How could we go back to what we were before, when everything changed so quickly? We had been through so much together, but this time everything felt too complicated. There was nothing I could do but wait and hope that he would come around, but his silence made me feel even more lost. I couldn't help but think about our daughter. She meant everything to me, but I also couldn't stop thinking that she might have another biological family, a place where she truly belonged. Was I her only mother? Or were we just temporary caretakers? I started trying to learn more about the process and what could happen if the truth was acknowledged. Would our daughter be taken away from us? Could we keep her if we found her biological family? Every question felt like a knife to my heart, and I couldn't find the right answers. The days that followed were filled with a heavy atmosphere. I didn't dare speak to anyone about this because I feared judgment. We still tried to live normally, but the change in our family was impossible to hide. Everything had shifted, and I didn't know if I could ever get back the trust and love in my family. This truth had shaken everything, and no matter how hard I tried, it loomed over every moment of our lives. Everything in our lives seemed to be spiraling out of control, but I couldn't stop worrying about the future. After the police investigation began, things became even more tense. We tried to contact the hospital where I had given birth to request clarification, but every time I called, I only received vague apologies and promises that they would look into it. Those responses did nothing to ease my anxiety. In fact, they only intensified my worry. I felt more and more confused when thinking about our daughter's future. She wasn't just the child we loved anymore, but a mystery. We didn't know where she belonged, whether her biological family wanted to meet her, or if they would accept us as her adoptive parents. I feared everything would fall apart, that one day our daughter would be taken away from us, from the family she had always known. My husband, on the other hand, was becoming more withdrawn. He didn't want to talk about what had happened, and when I tried to bring it up, he would avoid the conversation. He became irritable and exhausted, as if everything was weighing down on him. We weren't husband and wife anymore. We had become strangers, living under the same roof but not sharing our feelings, worries, or hopes. There were nights I stayed awake, terrified that things would never go back to normal. I couldn't talk to anyone about what was happening in our family. People outside didn't know what had happened, and I had no idea how to explain it if anyone asked. Our daughter deserved a normal life, not one lived in a tragedy we couldn't control. I didn't want her to suffer because of this incident. I started looking for support groups for families in similar situations. I hoped there would be someone who understood the complexity of our circumstances, that there would be a community where we could share and receive advice. But all I found were bizarre stories, sensational articles, and gossip. There was no one sharing experiences like ours, and I felt trapped in an unexplainable situation. One morning, when my husband finally stopped avoiding me, we sat down together to discuss our next steps. He admitted that he couldn't live with this constant doubt, and although he still loved our daughter, the questions about where she truly belonged made it impossible to continue as before. Though he didn't say it outright, I could see the disappointment in his eyes. I too was exhausted from not knowing what more I could do to keep this family together. Could we find a solution, or would we forever live in this uncertainty, never regaining the peace we once had? I looked into his eyes, trying to hold back my emotions. We had once been the best of friends, the ones who loved each other unconditionally, but now everything seemed to have changed. I didn't know if we could get through this, but I just hoped that someday we would find peace again in our family, no matter how hard it might be.